Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman here in our Northwest Side studio.
And I'm Paris Schutz, just across the border in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, right outside Pfizer's distribution and warehouse facility here. We'll give you the very latest on what's next for that Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine.
And also on the show tonight,
we are learning more every day about vaccines for COVID-19.
We'll learn more about that vaccine from an infectious disease doctor and how it fared with an FDA panel today.
A renowned sense of unity between black and brown communities.
Amanda Vinicky checks in with Pilsen neighbors 6 months after this summer's civil unrest.
Here at Lakeshore Drive now, we're going to combine the old with the new.
A 1937 bridge gets an overhaul as crews near the end of work on the long-awaited Navy Pier flyover.
Richard Trubisky in trouble. It's a strip. Ball is out.
A blown lead and a 6th straight loss. We'll talk about Matt Nagy and the Bears ahead of their Sunday game against Houston. And Geoffrey Baer has the story of a famous wagon supply company once based in Chicago in an all-new Ask Geoffrey.
And Brandis, as you mentioned, I'm live in Pilsen tonight. We're reporting for part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series. We'll be speaking with community leaders who were involved with part of a unity rally back in June. This is as we continue to check in on neighborhoods that experienced civil unrest over the summer. But first, back to you.
Amanda, thank you. And now to some of today's top stories. Chicago's lead doctor, Allison Arwady, says the city's 30% increase in coronavirus cases is clearly related to Thanksgiving and residents not heeding warnings to avoid gatherings and travel. This comes as Governor J.B. Pritzker says the state is seeing its case numbers moderate, but he emphasizes any progress is preliminary.
I said that I was hopeful that some of the recent early improvement in our COVID leading indicators will continue. And I'm glad to say that we have yet to see a reversal in our progress that would dash that hope, though again, we are not out of the Thanksgiving surge period yet.
Illinois health officials today confirmed more than 11,000 new cases of the coronavirus and another 196 deaths. This brings the state's total case count to more than 823,000 and the total number of deaths to 13,861. The state's test positivity rate is 11.4%. And you can read more about Chicago's post-Thanksgiving surge on our website. Chicago police are getting a clearer picture of how much residents trust them. CPD today launched a new public sentiment dashboard that tracks feelings on public safety and policing in the city's 5 detective areas and 22 police districts. It also breaks down trust in police by different metrics like age, gender, income, and race. For example, those over 55 are most likely to trust the cops, and black residents are least likely to trust them. The department partnered with a national data research company that uses confidential surveys to compile the information. Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccines are expected to ship to Illinois and the rest of the country as soon as the weekend. This afternoon, the FDA's advisory committee signed off on the emergency use authorization of the drug. Much of that shipment is being stored right across the Wisconsin border in Pleasant Prairie. It's a village with dozens of giant industrial warehouses, including cold storage facilities of the type needed to hold the vaccine at those below freezing temperatures. And it's also putting that tiny town just south of Kenosha on the map. Paris Schutz joins us live outside Pfizer's facility in Pleasant Prairie. Paris, did you catch any trucks leaving with the vaccine?
Brandis, we've seen trucks come and go from this facility throughout the day, but of course there is no way to tell whether it is carrying that COVID-19 vaccine. We haven't been able to speak directly to representatives at Pfizer, but local political officials tell us that this is the warehouse and distribution facility where that vaccine is being stored and where it will be shipped from. We're told a shipment to Chicago could happen as early as next week, early next week that is. And in fact, this facility is expected to serve much of Illinois and much of the western part of the country, west of the Mississippi all the way to California. Pfizer also has a facility in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that is expected to serve the entire eastern part of the country. And that initial shipment to Illinois is expected to be 109,000 doses of that vaccine to the 50 counties hit hardest by COVID-19, 2 hospitals there, and then 23,000 to Chicago to be administered at 37 hospitals in the city. And these initial doses are for healthcare workers exclusively. This batch represents only a portion of what is going to be needed ultimately for those healthcare workers. And Chicago will have to follow CDC guidelines in terms of who qualifies for this phase 1 batch of coronavirus. Now, this comes after an all-day hearing from the FDA's advisory committee that voted 17-4 to recommend the emergency use authorization of the vaccine. The FDA will reportedly push the button on Saturday, and then it's free to be administered after that. Again, we're told it'll go to Illinois and Chicago early next week. Wherever it goes, it's a race against time, whether it's Chicago, whether it's to Louisville to the FedEx distribution center, or to, Memphis to the FedEx distribution center, Louisville to the UPS center. It is going to have to happen really quickly. Northwestern Logistics professor Hani Mamasani says Pfizer has to minimize this whole process because it is shipping this 70 degrees below centigrade in boxes of dry ice.
That doesn't last forever, right? And so that gives you a certain window of a few days, basically, within which you have to move that product. Now, in moving it for some of these distances, they're moving it more in refrigerated trucks for the longer hauls to minimize the temperature differential. And similarly, as it goes on planes, there are special containers that are actively, actively refrigerated.
And Mamasani says once it defrosts, you literally have 3 hours to use it before it goes bad. And today, Illinois' top public health official, Dr. Ngozi Ezike, says she will take the vaccine when it's her turn, and she says she believes it's safe.
I do trust in vaccines. I trust in the development and approval system that has been created in this country. And from what is known, the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine has been evaluated appropriately.
And this is a proud moment for southeastern Wisconsin. We are right over the Illinois border, literally the first exit off of 94, just east of the highway. The administrator here of Pleasant Prairie told us, quote, Pfizer is a great corporate partner and citizen. We're proud to have them in our community. Pleasant Prairie is excited to be part of the solution to a national problem and a global pandemic. And the area's state senator, Van Wangard, echoed those sentiments of Wisconsin pride.
This is really good, at least from my viewpoint, to have something positive generated out of this that's going to give a lot of people a potential getting their life back to normalcy. So I think that's pretty exciting. And I think that we're pretty blessed to have this facility and these individuals that are doing that research and making this happen right here in Wisconsin and in the Midwest.
And Weingart tells us that the state legislature is going to have to tweak state law a little bit to eventually get this from Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, all across the country. Masana says there are some other logistics concerns as future shipments roll out. After all, we are talking about trucks, we're talking about highways, and we're talking about winter.
I'm concerned that we're going to get a major snowstorm. Fortunately, weather now looks good, but this is going to be continuing all the way through April. It's hard to imagine a winter in this part of the country where we're not going to be getting, some kind of bad weather, some kind of blizzard or something. And that may affect then the ability to get it to certain destinations.
Again, approval likely this weekend after that panel says it gives it the green light. First shipments to Chicago expected early next week, and then it can be administered right after that. And Brandis, we go back to you.
All right, Paris, thank you. And now to Phil Ponce and an infectious diseases specialist for more on the science behind the vaccine. Phil.
Brandis, as we've reported, it is a big step. A Food and Drug Administration Advisory Committee voting to recommend Pfizer's vaccine for emergency use. This comes as the United States hit a record of more than 3,000 COVID-related deaths yesterday. Joining us now to talk about what comes next is Dr. Emily Landon, a specialist in infectious diseases and Executive Medical Director for Infection Prevention and Control at U Chicago Medicine. Dr. Landon, thank you for joining us. So this vaccine has been approved by this, or recommended for approval by this advisory committee. What comes next?
Well, it looks like they'll need to go to the CDC for an approval from the ACIP or the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and then a formal rubber stamping approval from the director of the CDC, and then back to the FDA, who will probably follow with an emergency use authorization.
And as you know, Chicago officials are saying they're expecting to receive about 23,000 doses next week. It's a start, but yet given the need, doesn't seem to be all that great a number. Are you expecting, how soon can we expect significantly higher numbers of doses delivered to Chicago?
Well, I'm not sure when we can expect to see significantly higher numbers, but we have been told, at least our pharmacy team that's been working closely with the company and with the public health department, that we'll be receiving vaccine on a weekly basis, enough to vaccinate shipments of similar size every single week for the foreseeable future, allowing us to vaccinate everyone and also give second doses.
Getting back to this advisory committee, the vote is not unanimous. The vote was 17 in favor, 14 against, and 1 abstained. Should people be troubled that the vote was not unanimous?
I think it was only, I'm sorry to correct you, but I think it was only 4 against, not 14 against.
No, I meant to say 4. Yes. Thank you.
I'm not sure. I still would like to hear more about, every member has to explain their vote, and I'd like to know more, but I don't think it's that concerning. There are obviously, this is a new vaccine. It's the fastest a vaccine's ever been approved. And maybe their concerns are on the efficacy side, or because of the 16 to 17-year-olds, of which there were very few in the trials. So it could be some sort of technical issues that aren't really related to safety or efficacy that may have affected those votes, but we'll find out more when we learn more about why they voted the way that they did.
And again, just to clarify, the vote was 17 to recommend, 4 against. And at today's hearing, a top official with Pfizer testified about some of the characteristics of the vaccine, and let's hear a little bit of what she had to say.
mRNA vaccines can be boosted repeatedly, an important consideration when persistence of vaccine immunity is not yet known. Given that mRNA vaccines are essentially synthesized, they can be developed and scaled up quickly, a clear advantage over cell-based production processes when developing a vaccine in a pandemic setting.
And clearly, it's obvious that meeting was held online. It was streamed for people to watch. But she used the term "boosted" repeatedly. What did she mean?
Well, you know, when you're a kid and you get your first dose of, say, measles, mumps, and rubella, and then they give you another one a couple of years later, which is a booster dose. Those are meant to sort of reacquaint the immune system, make sure that they know that virus and can go after it when they need it. This is something that we do when we see immunity waning from vaccines. We recommend a booster dose. And some vaccines, like the MMR vaccine, only need a couple doses in childhood to make you immune for life. But there are other vaccines, like the flu vaccine, where we're essentially giving booster doses, although we are incorporating new strains every single year. And you'll be more familiar maybe with the tetanus vaccine. You have to get that every single 5 to 10 years in order to be protected against tetanus. So it's not unusual to need to boost a vaccine. The thing that's weird about this is that we just don't know how long it's going to be before we need to provide that booster dose. Because the trial participants were followed for such a short period of time, which was more than sufficient to identify any safety issues, we just don't know how long the immunity is going to last. Hopefully, we'll see that it lasts upwards of 12 months and we can just do a booster once a year, or maybe even less than that. That would be ideal.
Doctor, it's not known if Pfizer will have enough supply to meet the ultimate demand. Will there be other sources, based on what you know, that could fill in any gaps?
Yeah, so if you receive Pfizer vaccine, you want to get Pfizer vaccine for your second dose. And so it's really important that we save doses for that. But there are a lot of other vaccines coming our way. There's another vaccine made using the similar method with messenger RNA, which is really the technology that is allowing us to make the vaccines a lot faster this year. There's a gene editing technology that allows us to make these vaccines even faster than we ever could using what she referred to as cell techniques. And that's the Moderna vaccine. We expect it to get approved in the next week or two. And then beyond that, we're looking at a couple of adenovirus vector vaccines, which again use a similar sort of editing sort of way of sort of editing the material, the genetic material, in order to make it more like coronavirus, which allows us to make it the vaccines a lot faster. Those will be in the next group, and we're expecting to have those approved. So even if we can't vaccinate everybody with this Pfizer vaccine, that's okay. There's more coming down the pike, and they look very, very positive.
As you know, the United Kingdom started giving vaccines this week, and there were reports of some allergic reactions. How concerned are you about that?
Well, I got to tell you, allergic reactions are not uncommon. You know, I have a severe anaphylaxis to penicillin, and so I can understand that people sometimes have severe reactions, and I know a lot of people do. Now, the trials actually excluded individuals who were allergic to the vaccine or any one of its components. They didn't exclude people with generally bad allergies, people like me who carry EpiPens. And so the United Kingdom, though, saw 2 bad reactions, and they weren't calling them anaphylaxis. They were calling them similar to anaphylaxis, which sounds bad enough in my opinion. But they made the decision to say that people who carry an EpiPen probably shouldn't get the vaccine just yet. I don't know if we'll be going that route here in the United States. I'm not sure that I'm convinced. I would need more information to be able to make a decision for myself or for other patients like me about whether or not I would feel safe. But I think the vaccine trials did have some people have some allergic reactions, but not that many. And these reactions can be treated very simply if you have prompt and swift treatment in the area where you got the vaccine. And that's what happened to the individuals in the United Kingdom. So they did okay.
Dr. Emily Landon, thank you for giving us this roadmap as we look ahead. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Phil, thank you. We're now heading to Chicago's Lower West Side community. Amanda Vinicky and producer Marissa Nelson spent the day in the Pilsen neighborhood there as part of Chicago Tonight's In Your Neighborhood series. We're checking back with neighborhoods we visited over the summer, now about 6 months after Chicago was rocked by civil unrest spurred by anger over police violence against people of color. Chicago Tonight featured Pilsen in June. Amanda, how are things on the ground there now?
Brandis, Pilsen has long been an enclave for immigrants, those coming from Ireland, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and since the 60s from Mexico. It is also a community with many residents struggling right now because of the coronavirus, according to the director of the Pilsen Alliance.
A grassroots community organization, fighting to defend the neighborhood, against gentrification, budget cuts from the city, that sort of thing, fighting for neighborhood schools, our immigrant community, workers, youth, so forth and so on.
Moises Moreno says the Alliance, which is located on 18th Street, a busy corridor that stretches all through Pilsen, has served as a sort of hub, coordinating financial assistance and weekly food distribution. Now he says they're fundraising so that they will be able to help families struggling to pay their utility bills. The 60608 zip code that comprises much of Pilsen has a COVID positivity rate of nearly 14% and has seen more than 5,500 cases of COVID-19. Regulation aimed at curbing cases has made it difficult for the area's small businesses to thrive.
In the beginning of this pandemic, it was supposed to be a 15-day, break for businesses, and it was almost seen like a break. Hey, go home, small business. In 2 weeks, we're gonna come back. But little do we know, it's December, and again, numbers have rised up.
It's one of many battles that Pilsen is fighting. Advocates like Veronica Reyes of the Resurrection Project are working to secure affordable housing for residents who've called Pilsen home for generations, but are now having a hard time keeping up as the popular neighborhood sees rent rise.
It becomes a much more attractive neighborhood for families to come and live, which is great. However, it becomes a challenge when you start raising rents, and families that have been here for years can no longer stay here.
Photojournalist and creative Mateo Zapata says in the face of all of that, he has seen the community step up. Instead of waiting for the government to come in and rescue, he says it's residents who started things like a love fridge and a food pantry. We'll have more on that in just a bit, by the way. He says he took it upon himself to produce PSAs in both English and in Spanish to inform residents about the dangers of COVID, because he says he felt like nobody else was doing that sort of outreach to warn them.
All my friends are essential workers, and so I wanted that to be documented and the reality to be documented. And, you know, living through the intersection of a pandemic and the fight for social justice makes us confront the question that if our labor is seen as essential and our workforce is deemed essential, then our rights to having resources and equality need to be essential too. The right to safety in our communities needs to be considered essential.
As he sort of alluded to there, he was also on the ground and behind the lens to capture some of the movement that unfolded in many of Chicago's South Side Latino neighborhoods this summer. WTTW's crews were also on the scene to capture many of those events, including that Unity rally in June, which took place on the square that I am at now, following what Zapata describes as a quasi-race war between Latino and Black gangs. He says women in Pilsen organized the Black and Brown Unity Rally to show Latino support for the Black Lives Matter movement, and he says that rally helped to bring about an end to the racial discord. He says it was important to document.
The motivation behind that was just to make sure that the history that was taking place and all the Black and Brown Unity rallies and the solidarity for the Black Lives Matter movement on behalf of Latinos in Chicago needed to be documented. I didn't want that to be something that would be forgotten or not recorded in some way, because that tends to happen with movements in our neighborhoods.
The Pilsen Alliance's Moreno says the conversations may not be easy, but he says those dialogues are happening.
The first thing is to be honest, right? Is to be truthful of the situation. And yes, definitely there was this been racial tensions, and again, it was just the moment that it just sparked, right? It wasn't something that just happened overnight. And again, it's due to like a lot of things. You know, racial segregation is a big factor. You know, it's no coincidence that we share space with African Americans, and not just in Pilsen, but just directly up the viaduct. Again, we're separated by barriers, right? And the idea is that what we've been working on is first addressing our the community's kind of like anti-Blackness.
Walking through Pilsen today, you could see signs in many of the shop windows that said Black Love, Brown Pride. Now, one of the shops that's along that busy area on 18th Street is Escaramuza, which for 25 years has sold arts and crafts imported from 10 Mexican states.
Right now, we have the Talavera, which is well known, that comes from the state of Guanajuato. We have the nativity set right now where everybody's trying to celebrate Christmas. So that's one of the items that we have for the season.
Velasquez says each time the city or state implements new regulations regarding COVID, he says then business slows down for a week or so and then it crawls back. He says it's difficult not to know what's coming down the pike.
We're kind of scared because we cannot predict what's going to happen. At this point, we cannot predict. We used to predict stuff. Like we used to have a kind of a sense of what's going to happen in the following 2 or 3 months. But right now we're in a position where we cannot predict what's going to happen next month. What if the city decides to announce something new? What if the government announces something that is going to scare people? It does the scary part of it, the scary side that is unpredictable right now.
Now, you may have picked up, as I did when we first heard from Velasquez, and that is when he said trying to celebrate Christmas. He says even those that aren't struggling financially, well, he says we are all struggling as humans right now. For him, well, it's going to be just his wife and his kids rather than the traditional Christmas holiday that he celebrates with a dozen plus relatives. And that's hard, he says. We'll be back in just a bit to speak with Pilsen's 25th Ward alderman. But for now, Brandis, back to you.
Yeah, Amanda, the challenge is different for everyone. Thank you. Up next, a preview of this Sunday's matchup between the Chicago Bears and Houston Texans. Stick around.
can get past the idea of turning this into a political topic and really get to serving our communities, that's something I can get behind.
Maybe we can use this as a calling card to unite.
Controversy in college football. Indiana fans are not happy as the Big Ten changes its rules to allow Ohio State to take on the Northwestern Wildcats in its championship game. And the Bears' practice schedule is disrupted by another positive coronavirus test within the organization. Not what coach Matt Nagy needs as the Bears look to break a 6-game losing streak when they host the Houston Texans on Sunday. Joining us now is former Chicago Bears offensive lineman James Big Cat Williams. James, welcome back. Okay, so this question comes to us from our supervising producer, who's an Indiana alum and obviously an unbiased questioner here. Why does Ohio State get special privileges that hurt Indiana in terms of rules being changed to allow them to play in the championship game in the Big Ten? What do you make of that decision by the Big Ten Conference?
No matter how the Big Ten Conference ruled, somebody was going to be upset. Indiana, it's unfortunate for them, but the Big Ten wanted to get the best team in the Big Ten in the big time game. And, that's what it boils down to. You look at the games that Ohio was not able to play, and it was through no fault of their own. I could understand, I would understand a little bit more if it was through their fault that they weren't able to play, but it wasn't. So, and they're a pretty outstanding team right now.
All right. So the big news of the day, though, in the Bears camp is the temporary closure of Hallis Hall after another positive test. Do you think this game should go ahead?
Yeah, they said it was a pretty confined case. There wasn't a lot of tracing that went on to connect him to a lot of other teammates. So, for them to be able to get the go-ahead to practice later on that afternoon, I think that was a good sign. And as we've seen with the NFL, they might delay it, but they're not going to cancel the game.
Yeah, we've seen some games get shuffled around quite a bit. So for the Bears' last game, that was their 6th straight loss. Is Matt Nagy going to make it through the season?
I think everybody's worried about their job right now, from Pace to Nagy to all the other coaches, all the players. Everyone has to be concerned right now. You knew things weren't as good as they were supposed to be when they were 5-1, and you've constantly watched them slide. So now it's just a case of what can you do to save this season? Can you win the last 4 games and still have that slim shot of getting into the playoffs, or do the players lay down and not go out there and put the best performance on the field that they can? And if they do that, then you're talking about, possibly Nagy could possibly be going.
So you say everybody, is or should be concerned about their jobs. How much of this is, about personnel versus coaching?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think for Nagy's personnel, what he wanted for his personnel, what he wanted to be able to run, he was not able to run. And, whose fault is that? Do you blame that on Pace? Did he not get the type of players that Nagy needed? Or, is it Nagy's fault for not adapting to the players that he has? We watched a lot of what they did versus Detroit. That wasn't a bad looking, offense out there on the field, the types of plays they were running. And that was a change. And why did it take so long?
Okay, so what do you make of how the Bears blew a 10-point lead in the 4th quarter to the Lions in that last game?
It was unexcusable. The team is built on defense. And for the defense to give up a 96-yard drive for a touchdown, 6 completions in a row, and, you can't have that. They got no pressure on the quarterback. They weren't able to stop anything. And then you look at the last drive by the offense, and they put Mitch back in a bad position that, they had benched him for earlier in the season, as far as him just being a straight drop back quarterback. Get him out of the pocket if you're going to throw the ball at all.
So some former Bears players have been pretty critical of the team, and especially the offense after that loss. Is their criticism justified?
Yeah. Bears players are Bears players for life. You are always concerned about the organization, about the team, about the brand. And you know that you represent that even though you're not on the field anymore. And for all the expectations coming into this season, to see them having this bad of a letdown at the end of the season is hard to watch. And, there are a lot of outspoken players out there that will say something about, their organization.
Up next, of course, we've got the 4-8 Texans. What are you expecting?
The Texans are a team that the Bears could get right against. Defensively, you have to get the pass rush together. You have to be able to put pressure on Watson. He got sacked 5 times last week. If they can put some pressure on him, force him to throw up some bad balls, get some turnovers, maybe turn those turnovers into points, and the offense can move the ball the way they did early in the game last week, they have a recipe to win.
And if we've got about 15 seconds, what's your big prediction?
I just don't know if they're out of the funk they're in. So I'm going 27-24 Houston.
All right, it's going to be tight. Our thanks, as always, to James Big Cat Williams.
Thank you, Brandon.
You bet. And we'll see James Big Cat Williams again in the coming weeks, including next week for a preview of the Bears matchup with the Minnesota Vikings. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, food insecurity has increased amid the pandemic. How the Pilsen Food Pantry is working to meet the needs of its neighborhood. The Navy Pier Flyover, taking the Lakefront Trail over busy roads and the Chicago River, is finally close to completion. And Geoffrey Baer has the story of a Chicago manufacturer who left behind a haunted mansion in this week's Ask Geoffrey. But first, some more of today's top stories. Illinois officials today confirmed more than 11,000 new cases of the coronavirus and another 196 deaths. This brings the state's total case count to more than 823,000 and the total number of deaths to 13,861. The state's test positivity rate is 11.4%. Chicago-based United Airlines is pledging to reduce its greenhouse gas impact by 100% in the next 30 years, walking away from a method used by most other large global companies. United CEO Scott Kirby says carbon offsets can't be scaled up to solve the climate problem in the way many are expecting them to. Carbon offsets are credits generated by forest conservation efforts that are purchased to cancel out emissions. Instead, the company will invest in direct air capture, where facilities draw carbon dioxide from the open air and dispose of it underground. United's investment is expected to draw out as much CO2 as 40 million trees per year. And now we check back in with Amanda Vinicky, who spent the day reporting in Pilsen on Chicago's west side. It's part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series that's also checking in on communities that experienced civil unrest over the summer. Amanda.
Brandis, just a couple of hours ago, earlier this evening, I spoke with Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez. He represents the 25th Ward, which covers Pilsen. And I started out by asking him about that unrest that you spoke about, that unity rally that occurred here in June, and just about how Pilsen has adapted and recovered since.
We see a sense of solidarity across communities. At least here in Pilsen, we have neighboring communities in Abla, Holmes, Barbara Jean Wright, communities have been devastated by the pandemic. We see unfortunately, the big toll. African American communities and Latino communities have been affected the most, disproportionately affected by the pandemic. We've seen the huge effects, but we also have seen people coming together, helping each other out. When we put out a solidarity pledge to raise funds for families, an emergency fund, we raised over $80,000 from people from across the ward that really want to make sure that help each other out. The response from people, making sure that We work with collaboration with one another. We have a food pantry that is serving the 25th ward, especially the most vulnerable communities. We have a food pantry that is now also looking forward to serving not only Pilsen but our neighbors across the viaducts. And I think the solidarity among communities is felt despite the huge issues that we continue to face.
Do you have confidence in the city and in the government as the vaccine rolls out that it will get to those essential workers and to residents of Pilsen?
Well, I certainly hope that we learn from what happened with the response to testing, the tracing, and unfortunately the disproportionate effect that it had with our communities. We'll continue working with public health officials to ensure that essential workers are prioritized. We continue to have issues with testing. We continue to have issues with tracing. We hope that...
Not enough of it.
Exactly, absolutely. It's not adequate or enough. But I think that we as a community are coming together to demand a better response. So I feel optimistic that people are coming together to demand solutions. And I think here from at least in Pilsen, we have seen an enormous amount of organizing that I hope results in better policies.
Is there something specific that you need from the city or the state at this time, beyond just more testing, more contact tracing, anything in particular that you're demanding or hoping for?
I think that we got to move beyond the rhetoric, beyond the discourse about equity, but really translate it into policy. I think I'm concerned about evictions and foreclosures. We've seen what happened in other cities. I do hope that legislation is passed. So we have just cause for eviction, for instance, the legislation that is key. We also have legislation like Development for All, where developers put some affordable housing aside. We have a huge issue of housing. Pilsen in particular has been in the midst of this conversation. So my hope and my demand of the public officials is to come together to deliver policies that work. And my concern is that the influence that big money and developers continue to have in the city.
We spent a lot of today actually talking with organizers, residents, neighbors, business folks about the issue of gentrification and housing. Hear that an ordinance is expected in the city council next week on the heels of a couple that would have affected Pilsen failing. What is this proposal that you expect to back next week?
Yeah, so we have changed course. The course of the previous administration that has been a public knowledge full of corruption and inconsistencies, and an administration that has been tone deaf to the demands of the community, which is that people want conscious development. We want development without displacement. And I think that's what we're introducing next week, a deconversion ordinance that will start addressing some of the concerns that we hear from small businesses and residents. We also have an ARO bill that is going to come early next year. We hope to make sure that we make that also a reality.
And that's an affordable housing ordinance?
Affordable requirement ordinance that is also early for 2021. So we have policies that we hope to have the support of the administration. What people are demanding are solutions, and we're proposing a set of bills that we believe are going to address some of the concerns that our residents have.
And we will do more on this issue of gentrification and housing on Chicago Tonight coming up next week or so. Tonight we'll be back with the head of the food pantry here in Pilsen, but that's coming in a bit. So for now, Brandis, tossing it to you.
Amanda, we'll look forward to it. We'll see you in a bit. Thank you. And we still have much more to come in the program, including details of the long-awaited Navy Pier flyover. But first, this is the final night of the December membership drive here on Chicago Tonight, and this is the last opportunity for you to double your contribution through a challenge grant from our generous sponsors, Jim and Kay Mabee. We ask for your financial support because the majority of our funding comes from you, the people in our community. If you've made a pledge of support, thank you. If you haven't, we invite you to make a contribution to WTTW's Fund for Independent News, which supports all of WTTW's news initiatives, by calling 773-588-1111 or going online to WTTW.com.
Now more than ever, trusted local news is vital to our Chicago community. With your contribution to the WTTW Fund for Independent News, you'll join thousands of others in protecting the robust, fact-based news coverage so many rely on. Call 773-588-1111 or go to WTTW.com to make your pledge of support right now. All donations during Chicago Tonight will be matched dollar for dollar by our generous sponsors, Jim and Kay Mabey, up to $10,000. Please give as generously as you can. Call 773-588-1111 or go to WTTW.com. Thank you.
2020 has required all of us to grapple with big issues and make significant changes in our lives. That's also been true for how we report the news. If you're a frequent viewer of Chicago Tonight, you know that as COVID-19 closed down the city, we follow distancing protocols here in our studios, but our reporters hit the street to bring you stories that matter. For example, tonight, we just heard from Amanda Vinicki. She's revisiting the Pilsen community, checking in on the neighbors there after they experienced some property damage during civil unrest this summer. Last night, we heard from neighbors in Inglewood, and earlier this week, South Chicago. That's because we know it's important to hear from our neighbors all the time, not just when the incidents are happening. In response to the civil unrest experienced in the city, we responded to community needs by launching 2 new weekend shows, Chicago Tonight Latino Voices and Black Voices. The events of this year have taught us all that some communities that shape and complete Chicago felt their voices weren't being heard. So far, we've told stories of what's happening in those communities, but also new segments that provide history and context about how we got here. And to make sure you stay up to date on what's happening, our news coverage is available when you want it through live programming, video streaming, and online, as well as our podcast and 2 daily newsletters. 2020 has been a demanding year, but we are committed to our mission to keep you informed with fact-based, independent local news. This essential service takes financial resources. Your contribution in any amount will have a positive impact on our efforts to bring you the strong local reporting you value. It's the last night of our important December membership drive, so don't let the matching challenge grant expire without doubling your gift. Call 773-588-1111 or go online to WTTW.com to become a member now. And thank you for your support. Up next, the long-awaited Navy Pier flyover is nearly complete when you'll be able to use it. But first, a look at the weather.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
Chicago's Lakefront Trail has had a bit of a rough year too. Battered by winter storms, damaged and eroded by high lake levels, closed down by Mayor Lightfoot in the first few months of the pandemic. But there is some good news on the horizon. As Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg reports, the long-awaited Navy Pier flyover appears to be close to completion.
On busy days, as many as 100,000 people use the Lakefront Trail. But for years, there was a kind of a missing piece. Between Grand and the south end of the river where it meets the lake, cyclists and pedestrians had to share a sometimes cramped sidewalk next to busy Lower Lakeshore Drive. In 2014, officials broke ground on a bike and pedestrian bridge they called the Navy Pier Flyover.
We're going to make this safer. People are going to enjoy it more. Families are going to have a better experience, and we'll leave something for future generations.
But this generation's been wondering when it'll be able to enjoy the flyover. Construction was broken into 3 phases, all of which were supposed to have been wrapped up 2 years ago. The first 2 sections, taking cyclists and pedestrians over Grand and Illinois, opened in 2018 and 19. The portion of the Lakefront Trail carrying cyclists and pedestrians over the Chicago River was supposed to have been completed by the end of last year, but the project ran into some delays, largely to do with unexpected repairs needed to this nearly century-old bridge.
That's a 1937 bascule bridge. It was actually designed by Joseph B. Strauss, best known as the chief engineer of the Golden Gate Bridge,
which frustrated trail users have pointed out took less time to build than the Navy Pier flyover. Because there wasn't enough room to create separate paths for cyclists and pedestrians on the bridge,
they're actually tunneling through or taking out a section on level with that path of the 2 bridge houses. I think part of the problem and why the delay was that this is 1937 construction, which was very, very well done, but it really hadn't been touched since it was put up.
So in addition to widening the sidewalk for the trail, crews found they needed to make structural and mechanical repairs to the bascule bridge, a style of counterweight drawbridge the Windy City helped develop and popularize.
Chicago is known in engineering and architectural circles as the drawbridge capital of the world.
By the way, bascule comes from the French for seesaw, which McBriarty says may have originally been derived from a term for falling on your keister.
I like to think that the bridge itself then has that counterweight as sort of if you excuse my French, the bottom end or ass end of the bridge, and it falls down to then open the waterway.
The Chicago Department of Transportation didn't have anyone available for an interview, but says it's making steady progress and is pushing to get the full lakefront trail, including the Navy Pier flyover, opened by the end of the year.
Talking to the CDOT engineers, they love these bridges. It's a unique opportunity to live in a city like this and work on these bridges, which are part of our industrial heritage. Some of them are over 100 years old, and yet they're still operating. It's a pretty amazing story and rich history that Chicago has around its bridges.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg.
CDOT says the structural repairs to the bridge are scheduled to wrap up sometime next year. The price tag for the bridge overhaul and flyover came to $64 million in federal and state money. And now we check back in with Amanda Venicky, who spent the day reporting in Pilsen on the city's west side. It's part of our Chicago Tonight in Your Neighborhood series that's also checking in on communities that saw civil unrest over the summer. Amanda.
Yeah, Brandis, I'm now joined by Dr. Evelyn Figueroa. She is the director of the Pilsen Food Pantry. It's been around for about 3 years. And Doctor, nothing prior to that?
We are the only emergency food pantry in East Pilsen. That is correct.
And why was it important to have something like a food pantry? Seems obvious, but in the neighborhood.
So I'm a family doctor. I'm a professor of clinical family and community medicine at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I felt like I was not doing enough for my patients, even though I've been doing work in the Pilsen community for the past 2 decades. I went to school at UIC for medical school. So we set up shop at 18th and Ashland originally, not far from St. Pius, where there is another food pantry. Alderman Siccho Lopez helped us move during the pandemic over to 18th and Throop, which is where our pantry is now. And at that point, we became the only pantry in East Pilsen. But for all of Pilsen, there are only 3 food pantries, which is very different than other neighborhoods. Similar neighborhoods, Logan Square, East Garfield Park, have 7, 9 pantries in the same approximate size neighborhood. It's just a neighborhood that just hasn't had the same investment in people that are experiencing food insecurity.
So do you have enough food to give for all of those who need it to feed themselves, their families?
Unfortunately, no, we don't. Right now we have, in this new location that Alderman Siccho Lopez helped us get, which is in partnership with the Archdiocese of Chicago, we're in a deconsecrated church. We were able to expand our refrigeration and really step up and help folks that were experiencing food insecurity. Our numbers went up 50% with the pandemic, which is very similar to national numbers. So in 2020, we will serve the same number of people that we did in 2018 and 2019 combined. So we take care of over 1,000 families every single month. However, just to the north of us at 13th and Racine, there are several large low-income housing developments, and we're the primary pantry for them too. So we need to do a lot of work now that we've moved a little closer. Our 2021 plans are to actually expand and add another food pantry into the community just a few blocks north of us.
And you're a physician. Give us some more information on the health perspective that comes to this. When somebody is hungry, it's more than just a growling stomach. There's obviously psychological fears that come into play. What else?
This is such a great question. So prior to us going live, we were talking a little bit about the difference between a soup kitchen and a food pantry, right? And a food pantry is a place where you get fresh foods and you go home and you assemble them. So people experiencing food insecurity are also going to be challenged with how they assemble the meals, because sometimes they have interruption of their electricity and their gas for cooking,
to store it, to cook
yeah,
it.
there are limitations, but most people with food insecurity do have access to those things, although we make those types of accommodations. But we know that home cooked food is a lot more healthy than food that is not cooked at home. So all along, our philosophy has been to help our clients make home cooked food, and fresh produce is our biggest niche, and that's the thing we distribute the most of. Clients can come twice a month. The thing they get the most of is fresh fruits and vegetables. On average, they get 60 to 80 servings of fruits and vegetables every time they come to our pantry. So you asked about the health implications of being food insecure. Every year that you're food insecure, you have a 10% greater risk of developing diabetes. So after 10 years, you've doubled your risk of developing diabetes. Pilsen is largely Latinx, so you have 50% lifetime risk of developing diabetes.
So a lot of health needs, and the Pilsen Food Pantry, by the way, I'm told also now offers clothing to those who need it. So with that message, Brandis, I'm sending hope to everyone who needs it, and back to you.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, some important health implications there. Thank you. And just ahead, an all-new edition of Ask Geoffrey.
Ask Geoffrey is made possible in part by the Mollenhauer Progressive Philanthropic Fund in honor of Ida Mollenhauer.
What role did a Chicago tycoon and a haunted mansion play in the expansion of the American West? Our own spokesperson, Geoffrey Baer, is here with the story of the Peter Shuttler Wagon Works in this week's Ask Geoffrey. So, Geoffrey, this week's question, here goes. Is anything left in Chicago of the Peter Shuttler Wagon Company? How big a deal was the company in the first place, and what products did they make? That question comes from a viewer in the West Loop.
Right. Well, we don't often think of it today, but wagons were once the main form of transportation in Chicago and across the American West, carrying precious goods, belongings, and lives with literal horsepower. One of the premier players in the wagon trade was this fellow Peter Shuttler and his Peter Shuttler Wagon Works, which were founded right here in Chicago in 1843. So to answer part of the question, we couldn't track down any remnant of the company in Chicago today, at least physically, but Shuttler's wagons were well known in Chicago and throughout the American West for decades, in part thanks to expansive advertising campaigns like this one, hawking the old, reliable Peter Shuttler wagon. Shuttler's origins, Shuttler himself, his origins were modest. He was a German immigrant who started building wagons shortly after he arrived in Chicago in a small shop, imagine this, at Randolph and Franklin Streets. It turned out to be perfect timing. Here's a Shuttler wagon dealership as far away as Denver. Over the company's first few decades, the wagon trade exploded as settlers, many of them from Europe, flocked west. Shuttler's wagons were, of course, sold locally, but also by agents all over the country, not just in Denver, but in places like Dallas, downstate Carbondale, Illinois, and in St. Louis, the so-called gateway to the West. By the 1860s, Shuttler had become one of Chicago's richest citizens. Of course, his success came at the expense of the West's original citizens, Native Americans, who were systematically displaced and often killed as the United States made its ruthless push westward. When Shuttler died in 1865, the business was passed on to his son, Peter Shuttler II. They eventually built this massive factory at the corner of Clinton and Monroe. By the 1880s, it's estimated that in addition to humble farm wagons like this one, some 30,000 Shuttler covered wagons had crossed the western frontier. The Wagon Works would eventually move to a new facility at Rockwell and 22nd Street. That's Cermak Road today, so it would be in Little Village. It still employed 300 people in 1910, but by then, of course, the writing was on the wall. A pesky little invention known as the automobile was gaining popularity. Shuttler officially closed and sold off the brand in 1925.
Automobile, heard of it. Geoffrey, what were these wagons actually used for?
Yeah, pretty much anything we'd use a car or a truck for today, except polluting the atmosphere. We found this wonderful Shuttler catalog from 1879 in the Library of Congress. The company's products showcased here include the famous, the spacious farm wagon. Some of those were used by so-called truck farmers to transport goods into the city from farms in what are now the Chicago suburbs. along wooden plank roads like Milwaukee Avenue. And as I mentioned, they also built sturdy freight wagons for long distance travel on unpaved trails. Those were, of course, what we would call covered wagons today. Some Shuttler wagons can actually still be found around the country. Most of them are in the care of museums and collectors.
So what's this about a haunted mansion that we're hearing about?
Oh, yes, the Haunted Mansion. Well, in 1863, this fabulously wealthy Shuttler began construction on an opulent mansion for his family on Adams Street between Morgan and Aberdeen, so kind of on the near west side. But Shuttler died soon after its construction, and this prompted rumors that the house was cursed. It lay vacant for many years, fueling tall tales about ghosts and phantoms. The saga was detailed, actually, in this 1913 article in the Chicago Inter-Ocean newspaper. The writer calls the mansion a reputed rendezvous of ghosts and avenging spirits. And one of those ghosts was said to be Peter Shuttler himself, haunting the long hallways and overgrown grounds. Today, that building is long gone, and here's what's there instead. It's the site of a HVAC appliance distribution center. And Brandis, I'm unable to report if any of the workers there has ever opened up a new water heater or boiler and been greeted by the ghost of Peter Shuttler inside.
Yeah, we don't have any sources on that one, unfortunately. All right, Geoffrey Baer, thanks always.
My pleasure.
And don't forget that you can visit our website for more details about the Peter Shuttler Wagon Works. And while you're there, you can submit your own question to Geoffrey Baer. That's at WTTW.com/AskJeoffrey. And that's our show for this Thursday night. Please join us tomorrow night at 7 for the Week in Review. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman, and thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning for this program is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.